You're listening to the Blue Ridge True Crime Podcast, bringing you compelling true crime stories from the Appalachian Mountains and beyond. I'm your host, Alfred Dockery. Grab your hat and a lantern, and let's get on the trail. Today we're diving into a story that has all the elements of a timeless haunting folk song: love, betrayal, and a brutal murder in the post-Civil War South. It's a case that was sensationalized in the newspapers of the day, then immortalized in a mountain ballad that became a national hit in the 1950s. But at its heart is a real man, a real crime, and a real gallows. I'm delighted to talk to William Ritter about Tom Dooley, murder, mystery, and a mountain ballad. William, welcome to the show. Please introduce yourself.
Thanks, Alfred. Thanks for having me. William Ritter. I'm a folklorist and a musician, educational entertainer, I guess you could say. And I also run the Happy Valley Fiddlers Jamboree, or the Happy Valley Fiddlers Convention. It's now called the Happy Valley Jamboree. That's right up the river from... It's right where Laurie Foster's buried, but it's right up the river from the town of Ferguson, and it's in the area where all of this took place. So I'm happy to be on.
For our listeners who aren't familiar with the story, tell us a little bit about Tom Dooley and the circumstances that brought him to the gallows in 1868.
The setting for this is, of course, the aftermath of the Civil War. Tom Dooley was a veteran coming back. He was one of the fortunate ones to survive because on a percentage level, an unbelievable amount of Americans died in the Civil War. People don't realize that. But if you look at it on a percentage scale, it's really horrific, both on the home front and in the war. And of course, the disease became rampant, and it was a really trying time. But Tom Dooley survives that conflict, and he comes home. And of course, he comes home to a pretty devastated world in North Carolina. Even in the mountains as well, it was really torn up through a lot of kinds of violence, political violence, and just hard times, really hard times. And he comes home, and he's a handsome, young fiddle player. It'd be like a rock star coming home after the war. And he had his pick of the litter, I guess you could say, of attention from the ladies. And ultimately, his attention given to various ones. We don't exactly know what happened, but one thing in terms of who killed Laurie Foster, who is buried there in the farm I'm talking about. But we do know that she was killed. But we don't really know who killed her, but we do know that she was buried in a shallow grave in the woods, and ultimately that Tom Dooley was hung from it, like you say, from the gallows. And it's been a story that has gripped North Carolina for a long time, and about the time everyone was ready to be done and not thinking about that story, here comes the Kingston Trio. So it's really quite an interesting story, and has a big part to play eventually in the creation of the folk revival, and it's really an important flash in the pan, a moment that has continued to have ripple effects through time.
I understand. In my research, I saw that he was in the Confederate Army, that he was a private, and then later he's a musician. And I was curious, did that mean that he was a drummer, or does that mean he played the fiddle for them? Do you have any idea how that works?
So it could have been a couple of things. In that era, it wasn't unusual for fiddlers to also play the fife. Nobody much plays the fife, in at least in this tradition anymore. It's fallen out, but fife was a big thing. A lot of this music, a lot of the tunes, fiddle tunes we still play today, were military tunes. So these were things people would march to. Tunes that not only get set a time for you, but tunes that could tell you things. Oh, they're sounding the retreat. They're playing the fief number that's, okay, in an organized manner, try to get the heck out of there without killing anybody of your own team. Try to safely remove yourself. Or, hey, we're doing really well, let's play the charge. That music was used to help give directions for what to do. And also we got to think back into this era. Music was everything. People talked as much as they sang. Music was a part of life. It was something you did while you were building a barn, while you were hoeing corn. Anything you did, there was a music that would go along with it, whether it was an old ballad that had 32 verses or something, or people sang all the time, and they sang in groups to get things done, and they liked to work to music, just like we do today, when someone puts on a CD while they're bored at work trying to get through stuff. In those days, somebody might be sitting on the porch playing the fiddle, and you might think, I'm out here working and they're playing the fiddle, but I can tell you it's actually really quite nice. It's much better to have music, whether you're singing it or somebody's playing it. But in terms of the war, not only were there musicians that were playing the fife, and he may have well been a fifer, and there's even some cases of fiddlers taking their fiddle into war to keep morale up. So at camps, that was a place where people would play music, and that was a big thing. And having your musicians was something people really looked forward to, because it was terrible. And that was like your one little glimmer you had to look forward to was the music. So that was a big thing. He may have just been performing in the camps for morale and for officers' balls and stuff like that. So he may have been doing that. And being a musician was a good way, and has been a good way historically, to not have to do some of the worst work, and might have put him in a little safer position to some degree. But yeah, there's a lot of ways that a fiddler would have been used, or a musician in that conflict particularly.
Now let's get into a little bit of the people in our story. We've got Tom Dooley, we've got Ann Melton, we've got Pauline Foster, and of course we've got Laura Foster. So how do all these people fit together in the story?
It's quite the lover's triangle, and I've heard people say, and this tickles me a little bit, that they say, oh, even today, the three of them are buried in a triangle. And I said, and that's cute, but also there's 3 points. That's going to be true for 3 graves, no matter what, it'll be a triangle. But they're all buried in the same kind of area there down along the Yadkin River. But we have these several characters really that are pretty interesting, not just the main characters, but you have Ann Foster, who is often situated as the villain, and she had a relationship with Tom Dooley before he went to war. She ended up marrying a Melton, became Ann Melton, but she had a relationship with Tom, and a lot of people say that she killed Laurie, but again, we weren't there. Then you have Laurie Foster, who lived, I think, about 5 miles up the road from Anne, and they were cousins. And she, after the war, has a relationship with Tom Dooley, ultimately gets on her father's horse one morning, rides off, and is never seen again. And then you have Tom, of course I talked about, coming back from the war, handsome fiddle player. Think of him like a rock star of the era and of the time. And he was a hot shot. There's a story about one of his brothers getting in a little bit of an argument with him, and Tom pulled out a knife, and if his brother hadn't backed off the porch and fell off the porch, he was slicing for his throat. And the story goes that I think maybe it was Tom's father or mother or uncle, someone that was there, said he's going to end up killing somebody or getting killed, along those lines, that he's a problem. And yeah, it sounds like he was pretty hot-headed. Of course, alcohol was running pretty freely in those days. That was the main drug of choice in the mountains for some reasonable reasons, because you can't really transport stuff. The roads were not all that great those days, and you couldn't easily haul corn to town, but you might haul some liquor to town that you make from your corn. So that was going on. That was a part of the context. Sounds like some of these dances that Tom might have played at could be pretty rowdy places. People could get pretty excited by the corn squeezins. And those are your 3 main characters, but there's also, people would look at her name today and say Pauline, but the old timers would call her Pauline or Perline was the way they'd pronounce her name. And she is interesting because I believe she's a relative she's probably related to both of them, but I think she's a relative of Laurie's, or no, a relative of Anne's. I get that. Yeah, a relative of Anne's, and she comes and stays because she was there to be closest to the one doctor in the region. And maybe also in those days there were like conjure doctors and granny women and stuff that were known in communities for being good at making stuff for diseases like syphilis. And so the story we know is that she came and stayed with Anne, probably to get out of town and get out of trouble for a little bit, and hopefully get that condition taken care of. Ultimately, that condition gets spread around through love triangles, because contraception wasn't much of a thing in those days. And again, Tom was very popular with all of these ladies, and others too, I'm sure. And so those are your main characters, but there's some others too that I think are interesting that kind of have a smaller part to play. One of them is Aunt Appalachian, who was the last person to see Laurie Foster alive. And in fact, I believe because she was a person of color, she wasn't allowed, they wouldn't take her testimony, or there was something about the time. The way laws proceeded or in court was, some of it was very strange. There's a lot of interesting characters and an interesting time, and it stuck with us. People want to keep knowing about this.
One of the reasons that I think this story became what it became is that it was so well covered during the day. You have Tom Dooley basically hanged on May 1st, and on May 2nd there's a story all about it in the New York Herald. And the New York Herald article was really very judgmental and a bit heavy-handed. Let me just hit you with a paragraph of it. The community in the vicinity of this tragedy is divided into two entirely separate and distinct classes. The ones occupying the fertile lands adjacent to the Yadkin River and its tributaries is educated and intelligent, and the other, living on the spurs and ridges of the mountains, is ignorant, poor, and depraved. A state of morality unexampled in the history of any country exists among these people, and such a general system of free loveism prevails that it is a wise child that knows its father. That about knocked me out of my chair.
I've heard that line. I've maybe even heard that line used multiple times against people in Appalachia. Yes, a wise... I've heard that other places too. A wise child knows their father. Now, I will say this. We can get very prideful, and I know I have been. I'm descended from a few people that are like famous, but most old cultures in the world counted your genealogy matrilineal because that you can prove. You can be there when a child is born. You can't really prove who the father is very easily. Now we can, and we're finding out with Ancestry.com we're not descended from who we thought we were often. But I think it's important to remember that, yeah, that is really disparaging, but quote that you have there, and there weren't quite as many of the situations of haves and have-nots. So you have these early folks coming in before even the Revolutionary War, but then later getting land grants for fighting the Lenore family, for example, that the close by town is named after, were like over mountain men. They went to the Battle of Kings Mountain. But they were there really early, and there's these big, beautiful, fine homes all up and down that valley. There was Palmyra, which eventually burned down. That's where the Patterson School is now. But very much there's landed, educated, good number of slaves, families at that time. And so in ways, there definitely was a world of a have and have-nots. It's pretty crude and unfair, I think, the way that they put some of that. But there is an interesting dichotomy you don't have in some other places, but there were definitely, that valley was still that bottom is in the hands of a lot of the same families that it was when Tom Dooley was hung. There's a lot of it in the same families.
I just want to cover some of the broad strokes of our story so people can follow us as we move forward. In May of 1866, Laura Foster left home on the family mare, and her father wakes up and realizes both she and the mare are gone. And over time, when she doesn't come home, they set out for a search. And my understanding is that Pauline is the one who tells them where she can be found, and she is found in a shallow grave. Tom Dooley suddenly remembers that he has an appointment in Tennessee and heads out. And eventually, he is brought back and charged with the crime, and the trial is moved from Wilkes County to Iredell to Statesville. He's represented by Zebulon Vance, which again was another thing that made this a very high-profile case. And he's found guilty and he's hanged in Statesville on May 1st of 1868.
But if we just move backwards like a little bit from that, I think there's an interesting story, whether or not it's true, but it very well could be that a call is put out. She's been gone. They're assuming foul play is involved, and they find the horse, no rider. And so they put out a call basically saying anyone that turns in state's evidence, in other words, that can go help us find her body, basically saying, we'll let you go free. So what the story that happens, or that I was told, is that... So I think Tom has already left town. I think he already has gotten the heck out of there. So he's not available to rush to the courthouse and say, oh, she's buried here. But two people are, and that's Pauline, however you want to say it. And story is that she gets on a horse and she races there. And the story, she has a race with Tom's mother, who only has a mule. And of course, a horse and a mule that's not a very fair race. So Pauline gets there first and is able to be the first one to give the state's evidence saying she's buried over there. Now, they aren't able to instantly find her. They actually go out into the woods and they're like taking sticks and trying to find her body. They've got like dogs and stuff. And eventually, I think it was I believe it might have been a captain or a veteran.
The report I saw was a colonel.
A colonel, okay. A colonel that his horse starts getting really upset in one spot. They start poking around and they find her buried shallowly in a small hole. And then that triggers this whole storm of, going off to Tennessee, finding Tom. And of course, Tom just lit out of there sounds like he got out of there as fast as he could. And in those days, traveling was really dangerous and also hard, and just striking off down the road with no preparation would be really difficult. Of course, he'd just been through the Civil War, so maybe he was like not scared of much. And he was charming. So fiddle in those days could open a lot of doors. That might be the only thing he took with him into Tennessee.
I just want to briefly go through the account of the hanging from the New York Herald. At 24 minutes after 2 p.m., the cart was moved and the body of Thomas Dooley was suspended between heaven and earth. The fall was about 2 feet, and the neck was not broken. He breathed about 5 minutes and did not struggle, the pulse beating for 10 minutes, and in 13 minutes life was declared extinct by Dr. Campbell, the attending surgeon. After hanging for 20 minutes, the body was cut down and given over to the afflicted relatives of this terrible criminal. Again, the New York Herald is not on Team Dooley. And I was surprised that instead of having a trap and the what we normally associate with hanging in a gallows, that they used a cart.
Yeah, not unusual. And it was you didn't have to build a gallows. Didn't have to have any nails. Didn't have to take it apart. It might have been a place they hung people. Honestly, they hung people pretty rarely. It wasn't that common, and it was a big event when they did it. And they just, a lot of times in our minds or in the songs or in stories, there's the gallows. But it's just a tree.
Let's talk a little bit about the Ballad of Tom Dooley and how it fits or doesn't fit the history.
Okay, for one thing, there's a number of different versions of the ballad, like any old song, and this one dates back to the 1870s, maybe even a little later, but over time it's changed, and it's also not like a lot of ballads. Most narrative songs, or at least the ones I think of as the older ballads, a lot of the ones that came over to this country, they give you a story in a pretty linear way. And this one's almost more like a folk song, like a generalized folk song, in that it just gives you little snippets of imageries and says, you did this thing, and then and randomly now he's talking and he says, I'm going to die tomorrow. And then it has a refrain that's almost more like a chorus. That gives you a hallmark that it's a newer ballad. Now that's, 200 years old, but then that was a little more of a new styling on those. And for the most part, the verses that I'm familiar with aren't all that far off, except that, yes, shallow grave. However, did he do it? We don't know. There's reflecting real life, or at least the stories handed down. Gallows stories were like one of the favorite storytelling genres, and of course storytellers add stuff. But on the scaffold, he was supposed to have held up his hand and said, "Gentlemen, do you see this hand? Does it tremble? I didn't harm a hair on the girl's head." Which, depending on which version of Tom Dooley listening to, because some seem a little more on Tom Dooley's side, or at least leave it open that he didn't do it, and others are just like, he was a bad guy, he murdered her, what a jerk, but he's gonna die. But there's that one verse that says, Doc Watson sang this one, I never even harmed a hair on poor little Ari's head. And sometimes some of the bits of the story are embedded in there. I'm trying to think of some other verses off the top of my head without singing it. I love the line about, and depending on if it's a banjo player singing it, he might change it to banjo, but take down my old fiddle, boys, play it all you please. By this time tomorrow will be no use to me. And I like that. There's that one line that seems to have really thrown off the Kingston Trio, and that was that there was a character introduced
Yes, I
called
wanted to
Grayson.
ask you about that.
Yeah, and so that they start when I guess from what I understand, when they talk about the song, they would talk about it like he was a part of the love
Yes.
triangle, or like he was involved. He is involved in the story. He plays a really important part. Tom Dooley's working on his farm, trying to get shoes to keep on heading west, and he finds out because word was spreading amazingly fast. I think this goes to show you that there were people in that community that were really connected to power. I also think it goes to show you that Tom Dooley was a rock star. Like he was pretty big deal in, I think, the community, in that this wasn't just any old murder, like young pretty girl killed. Oh, we think that this like well-known guy, a playboy, is implicated. But Grayson, all that he ends up really doing is capturing Tom Dooley. I think he even maybe hits him over the head with a brick or a rock. Tom is down in the creek washing his feet that are really beat up from wearing soles have come off his boots. And the boots in those days were terrible, uncomfortable, unless you had a lot of money to get them made.
Okay.
And
Let's talk a little bit about the artist that recorded the ballad and how it moves through time and changes as it goes.
particularly the Kingston just in
Yeah,
general.
the next kind of spot on my radar really is the Kingston Trio in 1958. I know that they were recording a version or part of a version that had been recorded before, but 58 really seems to be where it gets on the map.
Yeah, and just to give, I guess, a little background into that, you have Frank Prophet Sr., who was a great banjo player, sang a lot of ballads, had a great voice. And he got to know Frank Warner, who was an academic folklorist musician of the time. And Frank recorded him to keep these songs from becoming extinct. And Frank would go around and perform that song. And somewhere along the line, either Frank gave it to, or somehow the Lomaxes, Alan Lomax, John Lomax's father, they get that song and put it in the American Song Bag? One of the books that they put out. And in that, it had Tom Dooley, Frank Prophet's version. And that's where the Kingston Trio found it and recorded a version of it, a little more peppy and a little more poppy, and take that, and it becomes a huge hit. I can't tell you the number of people that I know that now are like in their 70s playing fiddle and banjo and all this stuff, but they grew up often nowhere near Appalachia, that their intro to this kind of music, other than maybe hearing it around, but the thing that caught their attention, the gateway drug, you could say, to this old mountain music, bluegrass, all that stuff, country even, was the Kingston Trio putting out that record, and people just wore it out.
Yeah.
And it created this folk revival, really, part of it. A lot of factors were coming together to create a folk revival, always are, but this was one of the signature things that really lit a fire of interest in young people particularly, and then all of a sudden, this story that was some people remembered in Wilkes County and Caldwell, but they'd be like, don't talk about that. That happened a long time ago. That was really bad, and we don't want to talk about that. All of a sudden now as that song becomes popular, now people are wanting to know where Tom Dooley's buried. They're wanting to know where Laurie's buried, and I don't think either one of them at that moment even had a headstone. I think Tom had a headstone. I mean, it was literally a stone, just a rock. I don't think there was anything where Laurie is allegedly buried, and probably other people too, but we got to remember that this was a long time ago in a way at that point, and also it was we had gone through a lot as a country from the 1870s to then, and just a lot of graves were forgotten. A lot of them weren't marked well. Records were badly kept. Records that were kept in churches burned down. So there's a lot of stuff that would just be forgotten, but some people knew where Tom was buried, and some people knew where Laurie was supposed to be buried, and so they put up some new headstones, and promptly people came and started shipping off pieces of them for souvenirs. But it was a huge thing, really, a massive thing. Of course, that lights the folk revival, where all these college campuses now are obsessed with the banjo. They start bringing all these bluegrass musicians like Willem Monroe and the Carter and Ralph Stanley, and bringing them up to play at these colleges. And it's just this amazing thing happens. All these young people start going out to the country, finding old timers to basically be like their surrogate parents, teach them how to live in the old ways. But here come these young, big-hearted urban intellectuals, and they move in. It's a really interesting moment in history. But yeah, so that song becomes one of the most impactful probably recordings of the 20th century.
Yeah, just to give people a little flavor of the times. So they came out with the song in 1958. In December of that year, Life magazine had an article on Dooley describing him as a Blue Ridge Mountain folk hero. In 1959, the next year, The Legend of Tom Dooley, a movie starring Michael Landon, which the plot has nothing whatsoever to do with Tom Dooley, but he's in the title,
Yeah.
is released, and so Michael Landon plays him as a lovesick cowboy. Fun fact, in the movie, nobody dies. You gotta love that. And then in 1964,
Wow.
Doc Watson records his version. There was a lot of momentum there.
There was, yeah, and it really, really had a big influence. And of course, it also led to some interesting things just because there was a court action, like a lawsuit over the song coming from the Frank Prophets, along with, I think, Frank Warner and Alan Lomax, them
Yes.
for royalties. Even though it was a folk song, so that was an interesting precedent in that oftentimes folk songs thought of something, especially in that era, like, this belongs to everyone. But they were able to receive some royalties for it. However, I don't think it was really a big amount of money for the time, and it was divided over between the publisher and all that. And Frank, while I still think it was probably significant for a feller that was mostly a full-time farmer,
Yes.
in a little mountain farm, was like a significant windfall for him. I think it haunted him for the rest of his life, and he didn't live that much longer after that. And there's a really sad story about him going over to someone's house. I don't think they had a TV at home, and sitting down in the living room, and then I think it was the Ed Sell sees the Kingston Trio get up and sing his song, his family song that had been passed down generations, that almost nobody was singing except people in a really small geographical area. And even then, and this wasn't even down in Caldwell, this was in Dogga County, close to Avery County, close to Tennessee, that you had people still singing this song. I think in the actual area right around where it happened, people were, don't sing that. There may have even been ordinances in some of these areas that, like, you could get arrested for singing that song. That happened a lot with some of these murder ballads that came up out of a real occurrence. But yeah, it says he sat there and saw him come on the TV and sing that song, and he said it felt like a dear friend had died, which is really powerful, and it haunted him for the rest of his life, I think. And it's kind of an important story to remember when taking these old folk songs and taking them out and putting them up for sale, that you got to be really careful about what you're doing.
Okay. Let's talk a little bit about the legacy of this story and this song. It's endured for 150 years. Why do you think that is?
A couple of reasons. One is chance, right? I think there's a lot of luck or bad luck, depending on who you're talking to, involved. This obscure song getting picked up, a lot of things had to fall into place for it to become a song that everyone knows, or at least for a period everyone knew. But like a lot of these old songs that came up out of a murder, a killing, some tragedy, a lot of times I think you'll hear people talk about how ballads are written and they're like a way to spread the news around. We didn't need that. You could just go on what happened. You didn't sit there and write a song just to spread news. What they were was a way to memorialize that something had happened that we're fascinated with. That is something I think, whether we know it or not, is something that's difficult for us to rationalize or to figure out. And there's so many of these type of things that have happened in North Carolina just alone, whether it's Frankie Silver, Omi Wise. There's all these like questions hanging over these things, terrible things that happened in a way that I think helped them root in people's minds. Because it wasn't unusual when someone died or some bad thing happened that someone would write a song and put it in the newspaper, or they might even, sometimes they'd have a little printing press at the gallows, and that day they would print the song about what had happened. A lot of times they took an older song and just repurposed it and was like, here's the ballad of the killing of Bob Whistlebritches, just to make up a name. And it might catch on. It might be something that, like Tom Dooley, people are singing 150, however many years hence, or it might be something that just goes nowhere from there, or one old woman still remembers and got recorded in by a folklorist after the fact. I think there's a lot of luck involved, but this one does have quite, even if you only know the bare bones of the story, it's juicy. It can't not be. only have circumstantial evidence. And the tales have woven out in their different ways. I've heard very many different versions, for example, of Anne Melton's deathbed stories about whether, and others she said she had something to say and then rolls over dead. In some of them, it's very supernatural and like the devil comes back and drags her to hell, but they've diverged in many ways, and I think that's us just continuing to process and that these kind of bad things can happen. And maybe also, if you feel like justice wasn't served, that you can serve it in art. Omi Wise, for example, a famous ballad, Well-Traveled. John Lewis is acquitted. He doesn't go to jail, or he doesn't stay in jail. He's not hung. He gets off. And maybe he didn't kill her, but maybe he did. And in the song, he sure killed her, and he hangs for it. But that's not what happened in real life. And so I think it's interesting how songs kind of reflect more about us than they do about the facts of the case. And we'll never know there's really not a lot of facts to this case, other than that, yeah, she was buried in a shallow grave, and that they all had...
I got the impression that early on, it seems like Tom Dooley is the villain, and that there's not a lot of doubt about him being the murderer, and that while Anne Melton's involved, she's really seen more as either not so innocent bystander, or maybe she put him up to it. And then over time, I've gotten the impression that she becomes more the villain, and he becomes a hero for going to his grave, protecting her secret.
Yeah, I think it is really... That particular kind of narrative is something that's really appealing to people, that someone would die for for someone else. Just, even not, and in this case, in some cases, not even necessarily to save someone's life, but just to keep them from embarrassment. But it makes me think of that old 50s song, which everyone thinks is a lot older than it is, but Black Veil. And in that story, there's the man killed, and everyone in town says it looks like the main character, the singer. But towards the end, he reveals in the song that he wasn't there, but he couldn't give up his alibi because he was with his wife in a way that his best friend probably didn't appreciate. But so rather than saying, "Oh yes, I killed her," or "Oh yes, I was with Max's wife that night, that's my alibi," instead he just doesn't say anything. And it is really interesting how there's just so many, again, it's just all circumstantial evidence basically at the trial, which today wouldn't get someone hung. And so we just have all these gaps that are so easy to fill with our own questions, our own thoughts. It's hard to really know, given looking at the period documents, what everyone really felt about the situation, just based on what maybe the newspapers would have said too. They probably were trying to distill that into a pretty black and white story that would fit in the column. And it is interesting though, but there's a lot of stories about this where people were hung and they're like, we don't think they did it. But you have these stories like this, and I think it's just natural over time for us to question those. But it does seem, at least in the local area there on the Yadkin River, a lot of people seem to feel like Tom didn't kill her. There's the story where he's eating breakfast with one of the Wade Gilbert's grandpa, Wade Gilbert was one of the family members, later on was recorded in the 60s about this story, and it said that I believe I actually have the quote where he said, this is Wade Gilbert speaking in, I believe, 1968, but he says, "Tom, he eat dinner at my grandmother's house before he was arrested, and he went out after he eat dinner and said to Rufus Hall, that was my grandmother's man, taking some kind of medicine, a-googling it in his throat, or had some medicine, and said, the woman that give me this stuff said, I'll kill her if it's the last thing I do on earth." And that's a pretty serious... That's sure. Of course, people saying and doing are two totally different things, and he might have just been really upset. But it is all very weird that if Anne killed Laurie, that he would take the fall for it. And maybe, who knows, maybe he's thinking Zebulon Vance is me, everybody likes me. Clearly he made questionable life decisions, period. But maybe he thought, I'll get off of this. They'll let me off. Maybe Zebulon Vance had told him that. Turns out he was maybe not that great of a lawyer, or at least it wasn't in this case. He didn't do Tom any real favors, but you'd think having the former governor of your state represent you in court might do you pretty well, but this is also Reconstruction era. Everything was on its head. He probably was not as popular as he thought he was, being the governor of a Confederate state. there's just a lot of just blanks. There's just enough, we know just enough about the characters, and there's just enough in the story to make it so easy to fill in the blanks. It's interesting that there's other cases where, like with the Frankie Silver, where she allegedly murdered her husband and chopped him up and burned him in the fireplace, that over time it's become, oh, she was abused, when there wasn't a lot of evidence at the time of that. Granted, there's some context there. The women of Morganton put forward, I think, something about her being abused. They just didn't want her to get hung. And hanging a woman in those days, and often something they'd really try to avoid. They just seemed like something you wouldn't do to a woman. That was inappropriate. But anyways, it's really fascinating how, these characters have stayed with us, how their names are on restaurants in Wilkesboro, and how you can go to Whippoorwill Village, which on Highway 268 there along the Yadkin, and you can go learn all about Tom Dooley. You can learn about how the founder of that, I believe it was her grandfather, was a doctor in the area, one of the only ones, and he was at Anne's deathbed, which she died a pretty violent death. But on her deathbed, he was there, and walking out of the room, he's said to have said something along the lines of, when they said, did she admit to it? And he said, all I know is that Tom Dooley was an innocent man. Which, for me, I look at that and I go, that could say a lot of things. I don't think that's a smoking gun of any kind. And also, it doesn't sound, he might have been innocent of killing her, but he doesn't sound all that innocent. If he buried her. Then you had this Perline character, and she falls out a lot of the stories, but she's pretty interesting, and you have to wonder what her involvement was. She might have not been Tom Dooley might not have been any more guilty. She might have helped bury her, but since she got there first on her horse and turned in the state's evidence, I guess she came out okay. I don't exactly know whatever happened to Perline ultimately, though. Anne met a pretty bad end when the cart turned over on her. And it's interesting, if she got killed by a cart and then Tom Dooley was hung from a cart, it's an interesting death symmetry there.
Yeah, it's a heck of a coincidence. But in closing, do you have anything going on, any work that I can send listeners to?
Yeah, so the easiest way to keep up with what I'm doing is you can go to songtoseed.com, songtoseed.com. I do a lot of work with heirloom seed saving and the stories that go along with those, keeping those going. In the same way, I try to keep a lot of these old ballads, murder ballads, these old songs that have been passed down to me, just like the seeds have. I want to keep those going, want to keep people singing and thinking about them. And increasingly as I do it, I learn there's more that they have to offer us than just being relics. They actually have something to offer us, I think, as we go forward. They've survived a lot to trickle down to where they are these days, but I think we just need to give them a chance. But yeah, you can go to Song to Seed. I'm not that hard to find on social media. And the other thing, you can see my hat here. I've got the Happy Valley Jamboree. It used to be called the Happy Valley Fiddlers Convention. But if you ever, on Labor Day weekend, want to head out there, you can see Lord Foster's grave. We can give you directions to the other graves.
Which will form a triangle.
The whole music weekend, you can come camp. Yes, which of course, those 3 points will form a triangle. But Laurie is buried there on the property in a little sweet marked grave, and we try to for that story and other stories in the valley there every year with music and storytelling. We have a storytelling at the graveside that's always attended. I don't know what Laurie thinks about it, but I think it's an important story for us to keep trying to wrap our heads around and know what's gone on under our feet when we go places. But that's the best way. But I definitely recommend checking out Happy Valley Jamboree. It's free and it's a fun time.
All right. I'm going to close with a quick reminder to our listeners to like and subscribe to the podcast. That's it for this episode of the Blue Ridge True Crime Podcast. Thank you for listening. If you enjoyed this episode, please hit subscribe and leave a review on Apple Podcasts or Spotify. It helps more people find the show. Until next time, I'll look for you on the back roads.